She filed 17 complaints in 11 months, and when the last one finally landed, the city locked my front door. 2 years later, her building went to foreclosure, and I was the highest bidder at the county auction. I still have the numbered paddle in the back of my truck. I've thought about throwing it away a dozen times. I never do. My name is Nadine Collier, and I need to back up a little, because none of this makes sense without first telling you about a woman named Ruth. Ruth Collier was my father's older sister, the kind of woman who kept a pencil behind her ear from 7 in the morning until 10 at night, and could eyeball a 45-degree miter cut with an accuracy that made professional framers twice her age go quiet with respect. She grew up in eastern Kentucky, the daughter of a coal worker who died young, and a mother who cleaned other people's houses until her hands cracked in the winter. Ruth left at 19 with a Greyhound ticket, $200 in a sock, and a talent for making things look beautiful that she'd never once been given credit for. She landed in Fredericksburg, Virginia, took a job at a print shop, and spent 11 years learning the craft of custom framing on someone else's clocks before she saved enough to sign a lease on an 800-square-foot storefront on Caroline's Street in the Old Arts District. She named it Ruth and Rafter. She built the counter herself from reclaimed pine. She framed everything from oil paintings to Little League pennants to a purple heart belonging to a man who'd had it sitting in a shoebox for 32 years. When she passed from a stroke at 63, she left me the shop, the tools, and a laminated card she kept taped inside the register drawer that said, "Price your work like you believe it's worth something, because it is." I was 31 when I inherited Ruth and Rafter. I'd been working alongside her on weekends for years, so the craft wasn't new to me. What was new was the weight of it, opening that door every morning knowing it was mine to keep or lose. For 6 years I kept it. I brought in 2 part-time employees and converted the back room into a proper workshop. I added an online inquiry form, started supplying frames to 3 local galleries, and built a client list that included architects, interior designers, a pediatric hospital that commissioned a wall installation I spent 3 weeks on. On Saturdays, there was usually a line at the counter before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. That was the shop Rochelle Finch walked past on a February afternoon and decided she didn't like. I didn't know that's what was happening at first. Nobody ever does. She moved into the space 2 doors down, a larger storefront that had been vacant for almost a year, and she opened what she called a contemporary art gallery and framing boutique. The framing part is what mattered to her, I think, more than the art. She'd come from Richmond, had money of some kind that I could never quite trace the origin of, and she had the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a context she took seriously. White Mercedes she parked in the loading zone, statement earrings. Every single day, like armor. A habit of standing just outside her door with her arms crossed, and watching my morning deliveries with an expression I couldn't read clearly, but which made the back of my neck prickle. The first complaint was filed with the fire marshal's office in March. Someone alleged that Ruth and Rafter was storing excessive quantities of combustible materials, paper, foam board, linen mat board, without adequate fire suppression compliance. The fire marshal sent an inspector. I spent 4 hours walking him through my storage systems, showed him the suppression equipment Ruth had installed in 2009 and that I'd updated in 2021. He found nothing actionable. The inspection fee was $290. The lost workday cost me more than that. I didn't connect it to her immediately. I gave her the benefit of the doubt longer than I should have, which is something I've thought about since. In April, a complaint came through the city's ADA compliance office, alleging that my entry ramp had a grade exceeding federal standards. Another inspector. Another fee, $175 this time. The ramp was original to Ruth's 1997 renovation and had been inspected at installation. It was fine. It had always been fine. In May, the Virginia Department of Labor and Industry received an anonymous complaint about volatile organic compound emissions from frame adhesives used at my location, citing potential occupational health hazards to neighboring businesses. I have used the same adhesive products for 6 years. They are commercially rated for indoor use with standard ventilation. The investigator who visited me was apologetic and clearly embarrassed by the end of his walkthrough. Came back 2 weeks later just to let me know in person that it had been formally dismissed. He didn't have to do that. I still remember his name. That was around the time a neighbor 2 storefronts down from Rochelle, a ceramic studio owner named Fenn, pulled me aside after a local arts association meeting and said, quietly, that she'd seen Rochelle on her phone in the alley behind our block, on 3 separate occasions that correlated with the timing of my complaint notifications. Fen wasn't certain. She said it carefully. The way people say things when they don't want to be the one who said it. I thanked her and went home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I brought framed prints over to Rochelle the next morning. 2 of them. A botanical study and a city map I'd done for a client who had ordered duplicates. I knocked and smiled and introduced myself properly for the first time. She accepted the prints with exactly the warmth of someone who had already decided what to do with you. We talked for maybe 8 minutes. She said the arts corridor needed fresh energy. She said Ruth and Rafter had a certain charm. The way she said charm made it clear she meant quaint. I walked back to my shop and told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. 3 weeks later, a complaint landed with the city's Department of Planning and Zoning, alleging that custom picture framing, as practiced at my location, constituted light manufacturing under Fredericksburg's updated commercial zoning code, and that light manufacturing was not a permitted use in the Caroline Street Arts Corridor as of a 2019 code amendment I had never been formally notified about, because the amendment had been filed under a subsection that the city had not cross-referenced with existing business licenses. That one stuck. The city suspended my business operation license pending a zoning review board hearing. The first available hearing date was 6 months out. Even if I won the hearing, the review process and any subsequent appeal period meant I was looking at a minimum of 8 months with my doors closed. Probably longer. I sat in my workshop on the afternoon the letter arrived and looked at the half-finished frames on my bench. A shadow box for a woman's wedding dress, the silk pinned out and waiting, a diploma frame, glass already cut. A large panoramic photograph of the Blue Ridge that a family had brought in for their parents' 50th anniversary. None of it would be finished now. I would have to call these people and explain something I didn't fully understand myself. I laid off Colette and my other part-timer on a Thursday afternoon in October. Colette had been with me for 4 years. She'd started as a Saturday helper and turned herself into someone who could cut oval mats freehand and run the register and handle difficult clients, all with the same steady competence. She didn't cry in front of me. She hugged me at the door, and then I watched her walk to her car, and I went back inside and sat on the workshop floor for I don't know how long. I called my cousin Bet that night. She lives in Roanoke. She listened to me on the phone for over an hour without once telling me what I should do, which was exactly what I needed. I thought about selling. I want to be honest about that, because people always skip the part where you consider giving up, and I think that's a lie. I sat with the idea for 2 weeks. The building was mine, the lease was solid, and the name Ruth and Rafter was on a sign that Ruth had paid a sign painter to hand letter. Selling felt like more than a business decision. It felt like a specific kind of betrayal I couldn't square with myself. Aunt Ruth used to say, "The door is only locked from the outside if you hand them the key." I'd heard it so many times I'd stopped really hearing it. Sitting in that locked shop in October, I heard it again. I didn't confront Rochelle. I know how that looks. 17 complaints, a shuttered business, 2 employees out of work, and I just went quiet. My father is the one who taught me that. He managed a loading dock for 20 years, and he always said the person who throws the first punch in a dock dispute is the person who loses the supervisor's trust, regardless of who started it. I had watched that play out enough times to believe it, so I didn't throw anything. I regrouped. I found work within 6 weeks at an interior design firm in Spotsylvania, coordinating art selection and installation for residential and commercial staging projects. It was adjacent enough to what I knew that they trusted me quickly, and it kept me in the world of frames and walls and light, which I needed. It wasn't Ruth and Rafter, but it was something to stand on while I figured out what came next. What came next was the garage. I cleared it out in February, a year after the complaint started, and set up a workbench, a mat cutter, a decent clamp system, and a shipping table. I'd been watching the online custom framing market for months. It was underserved in ways that a shop with real craft could fill. I registered a business name, Collier & Thread, bought a domain, built a simple site with photography I took myself, and listed 5 frame styles with lead times and pricing that reflected actual labor. Within 3 months, I had more orders than I could fill working evenings and weekends. I hired back Colette as a remote coordinator, handling client consultations by phone and email while I cut and assembled in the garage. She didn't cry when I called her, not right away. She said, "Give me the details," in her usual way, and then at the end she said, "I knew you weren't done," and then she cried a little, and then so did I. Within a year, Collier & Thread was supplying frames to 11 interior design firms across Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. I brought on a part-time shipping assistant. I started attending every public zoning and planning meeting I could get to, not to fight anything, just to learn, to understand the system that'd been used to shut me down well enough that no one could use it that way again. That's where I met a man named Emmett. Emmett was a retired commercial real estate broker, 70 years old, who attended planning meetings because, he said, he found them more honest than most things on television. He sat next to me at 3 consecutive meetings before we spoke properly, and then over coffee afterward, he explained the 2019 zoning amendment that had been used against me with a clarity that 3 city employees had failed to provide. He was the kind of person who knew how things actually worked, not how they were supposed to work. It was Emmett who mentioned, almost incidentally one afternoon, that Rochelle Finch was having a hard year. She had filed a lawsuit against a frame supply vendor who she claimed had delivered defective materials. She lost. She had filed a complaint against her HVAC contractor. She lost that too. She had filed a noise ordinance complaint against a neighboring tenant, a violin instructor, and the city had dismissed it within 30 days. Legal fees from the cases she initiated were running deep. Her commercial mortgage, which she had taken out to purchase her building outright rather than lease, carried a balloon payment structure that required a substantial lump sum at the 5-year mark, which was now 18 months out. Multiple lenders she'd approached about refinancing had flagged her litigation history as a risk factor. She was having trouble getting the money together. I didn't feel triumphant when Emmett told me this. What I felt was quieter than that. The specific still sensation of watching something resolve the way it always had to, given enough time. Some situations are self-correcting. The trick is not to interfere before they correct themselves. I asked Emmett to pull the county property records. He did. 2 years of delinquent property taxes. A judgment lien from the vendor lawsuit she'd lost. A missed balloon payment that her lender had already filed notice on. By the time I was reading those records, the foreclosure process had been running for several months. The counties had scheduled an auction date. I registered to bid under Collier & Thread Holdings, LLC, Emmett's suggestion. His reasoning was practical. In a small arts corridor where everyone knew everyone's business, announcing myself before the gavel came down would only complicate things. Bidder registration is public record after the fact. Everything before it could stay quiet. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in November at the County Courthouse Annex on Princess Anne Street. A low-ceilinged room with fluorescent tube lighting and laminate folding tables, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where significant things happen without significance. I signed in, took my numbered paddle, and found a seat near the back. 4 other registered bidders. 1 didn't show. 1 dropped out before the auctioneer finished reading the property description. 2 remained through the opening rounds. Me and a property investor from Northern Virginia, who I later found out had been picking up distressed commercial properties along the I-95 corridor for the past 4 years. He was methodical. He bid in even increments of 2,000 and watched the room with no expression at all. The opening bid was $58,000. We went back and forth, measured and unhurried, until he stopped at $88,000 and looked at his phone, and then at the ceiling in a way that told me he'd hit the ceiling he'd set for himself before he walked in. I bid $91,500. The auctioneer asked if there were further bids. He asked again. The investor from Northern Virginia set down his paddle. The gavel came down. I sat with my hands in my lap and breathed and thought about Ruth in her first 800-square-foot space on Caroline Street with a counter she'd built from reclaimed pine and a laminated card inside the register drawer. I went to see Rochelle 3 days later, before the transfer was finalized and before she received the certified notice from the county. I believe that kind of conversation deserves to happen in person rather than in paperwork. That's a standard I hold for myself, regardless of what the other person has done. She opened the door of the gallery knowing already. The arts corridor is a small world. Her earrings were pearl drops, white against a dark blazer, and her face was composed in the way faces get when someone has spent 3 days preparing for a moment they hoped wouldn't come. "You could have just competed with me," she said, not loudly. Almost carefully, The way you speak when the anger has run down and what's underneath is something smaller and more honest. I was never competing with you, I said. I was running a business my aunt spent her whole life building. She looked past me for a moment at the street. I was trying to establish something here. This block, this particular block, I had plans. So did I said. So did Ruth. She had plans for 30 years on this block. Rochelle's mouth tightened. You think you understand what this is? I understand you filed 17 complaints in 11 months to get my doors closed, I said. I understand the last one worked. I understand you used a zoning technicality that existed because a city clerk failed to notify affected businesses about a code amendment. That's what I understand. She didn't answer that. There was a long pause in which I heard the faint sound of the violin instructor 2 doors down running scales, the same one whose noise complaint Rochelle had filed and lost. You have 30 days from the transfer date, I said. I'm giving you 45, not because I owe it to you, because I don't want to be someone who doesn't. I left without waiting for a response. I didn't look back at the gallery as I walked to my truck. Her attorney filed a challenge to the foreclosure process within the week. Procedural grounds related to the notification timeline on the original tax delinquency. I had a real estate attorney of my own by then, a woman named Petra. Actually, her name was Lenora, a name that suited her exactly. Careful, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who reads every footnote. Lenora told me within 4 days that the bank's filing was clean and that the challenge would likely be withdrawn once Rochelle's attorney read the actual record. It was withdrawn in 17 days. The arts corridor had watched everything from a distance the way small business communities do, quietly, from behind glass, making mental notes. Once the fuller story of the complaint spread, the way it always does in a neighborhood where people talk over their loading docks and their coffee cups and their sidewalk conversations, the people who had been friendly with Rochelle out of proximity, rather than conviction, stopped making the effort. I didn't encourage that, it happened on its own. Most things, given time, do. I spent the following spring converting the building. The ground floor became the new Ruth and Rafter, larger than the original space, with a proper gallery wall and a workshop with natural light and enough room for 2 full bench stations. I kept Ruth's old counter. I'd put it in storage 2 years before, when I thought I might need to sell the equipment. And getting it back out and setting it in the new space felt like something closing that had been left open too long. I called Colette first, before I announced anything publicly. I told her I was opening again, in a better location, with her name on a full-time offer if she wanted it. She said, "When do I start?" I told her the date. She said, "Okay." And then there was a pause, and then she said, "Nadine, I knew you weren't done." Exactly the way she'd said it the first time, and we both did the same thing we'd done before. I also rehired my other part-timer, a young man who'd found a job at a hardware store during the closure, and who came back to framing, he said, because cutting mapboard was the only job where he never once looked at the clock. The section of the building I didn't need for the shop I leased to a small printmaking studio that had been looking for space on the corridor for 2 years. The lease income covered the property tax and then some. I used the difference to retire the last of the small business loan Ruth had taken out in 2002 to buy the original sign and the first professional mat cutter. It felt right to be the one to close that. I still have the auction paddle. Paddle number 11, a plain white cardstock rectangle with a black number printed on it, bent slightly at one corner from being in my glove compartment for 6 months before I moved it to the back seat, then behind the seat, then into the door pocket of the cab where it lives now. I've driven past the old location of Ruth and Rafter more times than I've counted. The space is occupied now by a candle company. They have nice signage. The new Ruth and Rafter has been open for 8 months. On Saturdays, there is usually a line at the counter before Colette has finished unlocking the register. I have a shadow box on the wall behind the counter that contains 3 things. My aunt's laminated card from inside the original register drawer, the letter from the city suspending my operating license, and a photograph of me standing on the courthouse steps the morning of the auction, holding a numbered paddle and squinting into November light. People ask what it means. I tell them it's a reminder, not of what was taken and not of what I took back. A reminder of how quiet 2 years can be when you're learning instead of reacting, and how loud one gavel sounds when you've been patient long enough to be in the right room when it falls. There are people who will use every available mechanism, every complaint form, every code technicality, every regulatory inbox, to dismantle what you built. What they never quite calculate is this: every system they weaponize against you is a system you can learn. And some of us are very good students.